and a very good reflection by Ajahn Sumedho on the three refuges, the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And as you may know, Ajahn Sumedho is the most senior disciple of Ajahn Chah, the well-known Thai forest monk. Refuge in the Buddha. What is a refuge? A refuge is a place of safety, a secure place where it is peaceful and sane, not crazy, insane, and confused. A place where there's understanding, intelligence, and harmony, away from the world of confusion and disharmony, craving and greed, hatred and ill will, anxiety, ignorance, and delusion. Because people's minds are restless and confused. They're caught by craving, resentment, and delusion. And so they take refuge in the wrong things. They hurt and kill others. They steal and cheat. They compete with others and get angry and upset. They say bad things and spread rumors. People behave very selfishly, only thinking about themselves and what they possess. They only think in terms of me and mine. Their minds are caught in this illusion of self or ego, and so they cause problems for themselves and for others. Most people do not understand themselves, understand their own minds and the laws of nature, and are therefore restless, anxious, and confused, constantly grasping and clinging to worldly things, including to ideas, concepts, ideals, views, and opinions. They do not know the Dhamma, the nature of the world, and the way things are. The more we understand the Dhamma through study, reflection, and meditation practice, mind training and cultivation, the more we begin to realize the profundity, the depth and vastness of the Buddha's teachings. And it becomes a real joy, very exciting and wonderful to take the three refuges in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And this inspires the mind. Many traditional Buddhists in countries like Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka constantly repeat and chant the three refuges during their ceremonies. But it's just habitual repetition of words. It doesn't mean anything after a while. It's just a habit. Similarly, taking the 5 precepts by the lay devotees has become a habitual part of the ceremony. It becomes empty and meaningless after some time. So they keep taking the 5 precepts at every ceremony, and they keep breaking the precepts. It's nothing special. People do not bother to reflect, to think over, and actually find out, investigate what they mean, what refuge mean, what Buddha means, and so on. Just repeating words is not enough. We have to calm the mind first, then reflect, contemplate on what they mean. The word Buddha is a lovely and interesting word. It means the one who is awake, or the one who knows intuitively. The person who is alert and wise, intelligent, clear, and peaceful, patient, kind, and compassionate. And the first refuge is in the Buddha, as a personification the human symbol and example of wisdom and compassion. What was the Buddha awake to? He was awake, alert, and sensitive to the problems, confusion, and suffering of the world. He understood the truths of existence and the nature of the human condition. When we take refuge in the Buddha, it doesn't mean that we take refuge in a person or in a God or some savior. We take refuge in that which is wise and intelligent, sane, kind, and compassionate in the world, in the universe, in human nature, in our own minds and hearts. It means that we dedicate ourselves to the noble path, to the way of understanding, peace, and wisdom. It means that we want to follow the Buddha's example, the example of Siddhartha Gautama, in seeking the highest truth, enlightenment, so that our minds can be free of worry, fear, anxiety, sorrow, craving, hatred, and delusion, mental suffering. And we can become peaceful and joyful human beings. The Buddha was a healer, a doctor of mental, emotional problems. And in teaching the Dhamma, he wanted us to understand our own minds and to take responsibility for our mental health and sanity, and not to depend on others. He wanted us to awaken our own Buddha nature, our own wisdom mind. Some people worship the Buddha as a god, as a supernatural being, asking for good luck in business and family matters, and then asking for more money and wealth. They pray and wave joss sticks at the Buddha statue. This is only superstition caused by fear, uncertainty, insecurity, and craving, desire. They want the Buddha as a powerful outside agent to help them fulfill their wishes and dream. This is not the true meaning of taking refuge in the Buddha. Superstitious people also want charms and talismans to protect them from ghosts and spirits, bullets and knives, etc. They often ask monks to give them these things, and they're willing to pay a lot for them. This is taking refuge in fear and superstition. And this doesn't help us, because fear will come back again and again to trouble us. Dealing with fear takes a lot of awareness and insight. People in Western countries are now more modern and sophisticated. They don't take refuge in magic charms and talismans. Christians take refuge in the belief that there is a God and eternal life after death. People take refuge in money, in the bank, in the stock market, in lottery tickets, hoping to win a lot of money. People take refuge in material possessions, romantic relationships, and sense pleasures. They believe that these things, these pleasures, will give them true and lasting happiness and security. Some take refuge in their physical beauty, good health, and strength. But that is still taking refuge in things that offer no real safety, because these things are impermanent, temporary, and uncertain. These things and conditions around us and in us can change at any time. We cannot guarantee what will happen in the future. Life is uncertain, always changing. Only death is certain. Our bodies and physical looks have to change. We have to grow old, experience illness, and we all have to die someday. Our health and strength have to change. This is the law of nature. So there's no safety in the material and the physical world. Our parents, spouses and children, and friends also have to grow old and die someday. Taking refuge in the Buddha, in wisdom, in right understanding and view, when we understand the conditions of this world, when we live and act wisely, we can accept these natural changes, the ups and downs of life, with peace, humility, and equanimity. This is our real place of safety, our real home, a peaceful and wise mind that understands and accepts the changing conditions of existence. This is the Buddha mind. Refuge in the Dhamma. It is to walk in the footsteps of the Buddha and other wise and noble beings, to follow their example. It is to devote one's life to spiritual growth and understanding, to clearly realize the nature of existence so that we can become like the Buddha, wise, peaceful, patient, kind, and compassionate. The Dhamma is not separate from daily living. It is not a subject that you only read in books about Buddhism and philosophy. It has to do with the nature of the world and the human condition, and not what our conditioned minds think or believe it to be. Our conditioned minds prevent us from seeing the world as it really is. It is limited, and it is caught in the illusion of thoughts, ideas, and concepts and images. Hence, our confusion, greed, anxiety, fear, prejudices, anger, and so on. It is our conditioned mind that gives us problems, our reactive thinking. So taking refuge in the Dhamma is to follow the path of self-knowledge, wisdom, and freedom. The Buddha did not invent or create the Dhamma, some new philosophy about life. He was simply awakened, enlightened to the truth of existence, to the Dhamma, the laws of nature and the human condition, which existed before the Buddha and still exists today. So when we are awakened, when we understand the Dhamma, we too become Buddhas. We become timeless, unconditioned, and free. The practice of Dhamma is not dependent on being a monk or a nun. It depends on right understanding and view. The Dhamma is timeless, eternal truth or reality. It is beyond the conditioned mind, beyond the thinking process and the concept of self. It is always here and now, like the air and the sky. Refuge in the Sangha. Sangha means a community of monks and nuns, also lay devotees, a spiritual group of friends, people who can encourage and inspire you to lead a noble life towards wisdom and peace. The Buddha encouraged people to have noble friends for guidance, support, and inspiration. A teacher should be a noble friend and guide. Following the example of the noble ones, we do good deeds, avoid bad, unwholesome actions, and we make the effort to purify the mind through training and cultivation. and we try our best to observe the precepts. We take refuge in virtue, in that which is good, decent, kind, generous, and compassionate. Patience is a virtue. We don't take refuge in those things in our mind that are mean, negative, nasty, cruel, selfish, jealous, hateful, and resentful, and greedy. In our relationships, we strive to be kind, patient, and understanding, so that there is peace and harmony, less division and conflict. If somebody gives us problems, we don't hold a grudge. We don't get angry and cling to negative emotions. We make effort using mindfulness to let go of those negative thoughts and emotions. We forgive and forget. We let go of conflicts and bad memories and hurt feelings. If we cling to these things, we only suffer. Our minds will not be peaceful. Our hearts will not be open and loving. We all have good thoughts and feelings, and sometimes bad thoughts and feelings. Conditions in the world are changing and impermanent. Good and bad thoughts and feelings come and go. They change. But we take refuge in virtue, in goodness, rather than in hatred, resentment, and aversion, in negative conditions of the mind. We take refuge in our wholesome states of mind, which are kind, compassionate, and loving towards ourselves and others. Actually, when we reflect more, we begin to see that the real enemy, the real problem in life, are our own defilements and unwholesome states, or anger and aversion, pride, arrogance, selfishness, and so on. So refuge in the Sangha is a very practical, useful refuge in daily living. We can have peace, goodwill, and harmony with others and with ourselves. We don't blame others for our problems, for the way we feel. We have to take complete responsibility for our mental, emotional states, for how we live, for our speech and actions. It is so easy to blame others, our family and friends, our parents, our politicians, our society, our country, even our teachers. If only they were wise, intelligent, kind, and understanding, etc., then I wouldn't be having these problems. When we take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, we realize that to blame others for our problems, for the way we feel, is immature and a complete waste of time. We have to take responsibility for our own life and live it with intelligence and wisdom. Even if we had bad parents or poor parents, it still doesn't matter. There is no one to blame but ourselves, our own ignorance, selfishness, pride, arrogance, and conceit. We forgive, we let go of those bad memories, here and now. We free the mind of defilements, unwholesome thoughts and feelings. This is the path of maturity, truth, and peace. The path of wholesome living, mind training and cultivation, and wisdom. As you know, as human beings, we have traditions, we have ceremonies, and so on. And in a ceremony, we often take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhammang saranam gacchami, Sangham saranam gacchami, and so on. Now, in Dhamma practice, or true refuge, is in the four foundations of mindfulness. Because as you may know, before the Buddha passed away, many of the monks and the lay devotees who were not, or they had not attained enough wisdom and mindfulness, still had emotional attachment to the Buddha. But those who were very wise, very calm, they could accept the Buddha's impending death with equanimity and compassion. And some of them, because of their emotional attachment, they pleaded with the Buddha not to die, not to leave them. And the Buddha said, "Have I not been teaching you that all things are impermanent, even those who are dear to us?" Then he reminded them that one has to be a light onto oneself. One has to be an island onto oneself. And then he reminded them that the true refuge is in the four foundations of mindfulness. Because he said, all teachers are impermanent, myself included. Teachers come and go. So your true refuge, when teachers come and go, is the four foundations of mindfulness. And of course, with Dhamma practice, we begin to see more and more the benefits of mindfulness, of present moment awareness. And we begin to see that this is only through present moment awareness, mindfulness, that we can overcome dukkha, mental, emotional suffering, and conflict. Now, initially, we don't have enough trust and confidence in present moment awareness, simply because of the way we're educated. Most of us are not educated with mindfulness practice and taught the benefits of mindfulness, but rather we're only taught subjects. And we believe that to think is the highest state of intelligence. And so we become very attached to thinking. We identify very strongly with our mental states, our mental formations. And as you know, we're only taught subjects. And we have to study to pass exams, to be qualified. And we're not really taught to understand the nature of thinking, and also the nature of our mental defilements. Because when we investigate, we begin to see that our mental defilements are created by thinking, by our mental reactions. So when we get involved in Dhamma teaching and Dhamma practice, then we begin to see more and more the benefits and the freedom of mindfulness, of present moment awareness and knowing. Because this knowing that the Buddha talks about is intuitive knowing. It's not intellectual knowing. Because intellectual knowing is based on thinking, memory, and knowledge, information. But intuitive knowing is very different. And it's a part of our Buddha nature. Intuitive knowing goes with mindfulness. For example, when we breathe in mindfully, we know we're breathing in, don't we? When we breathe out mindfully, we know we're breathing out. It's like when you're hungry or tired, you know you're hungry or tired. It's not an intellectual knowing, all right? It's very different. So it's a natural intelligence because it's intuitive. It's like if you have to go to the washroom, you know you have to go. So it's a natural intelligence, part of our Buddha nature. Just like if you're driving, you know when to stop, when to turn right, when to turn left. And if you have to change lanes, you know when it is safe to change lanes. And if you're crossing the road, you look right, you look left, right, and you know when it is safe to cross, right? It's a natural intelligence. So when we begin to practice mindfulness, present moment awareness, we begin to see this natural intelligence, this knowing, part of our Buddha nature. Because when we don't have this education, this training, then we become too attached to the intellect. And you find countries that tend to be very intellectual, namely North America and Northern Europe. You see how deluded they are. They may be very clever on the intellectual level, but they have very little common sense, very little intuitive wisdom. Because common sense is not common. And the more intellectual, the more educated we are, the less common sense we have, natural intuitive wisdom. Because I grew up in a country where a lot of people had common sense. And most of these people were illiterate. They were the older generation of African descendants. Many of them were illiterate. They just didn't have a chance to go to school. They were either farmers or just common laborers. But they had a lot of common sense, natural wisdom, because their minds were not complicated with all this intellectual knowledge. And I remember they used to tell me two things when I was young, and I never forgot it. And one of the things they used to tell me was, time takes care of everything. Some things last longer than some, but in the end, time takes care of everything. Now, in more modern English, what is that saying? I'll repeat it. Time takes care of everything. Some things last longer than some, but in the end, time takes care of everything. In more modern English, what they were trying to tell me, that all things are impermanent, right? And the second thing they used to tell me was if you take yourself too seriously, you're going to have problems in life. Now, is that the Dhamma or what? That is the Dhamma. And what is amazing, these people had no idea what Buddhism was, what Dhamma was. And even if there were Dhamma books around, they wouldn't have been able to read it because they were illiterate. But they had a lot of common sense, a lot of natural intelligence about life, their own experience, and they saw these truths, that all things are impermanent, and if you take yourself too seriously, if you're too attached to ego, you're going to have problems in life. So it shows you that the Dhamma is eternal truth. And as we said, according to the reading, the Buddha did not invent the Dhamma. He did not create some new doctrine, but rather he was awakened to the truth of Dhamma. And this is why he taught in such a radical way. He wanted people to question, to find out, not just blindly accept what they hear or they read. Very radical teacher. Someone who existed over 2,500 years ago. It's quite amazing when you think of it. And this is why he taught in such a radical way. And he always reminded people, I can only point the way. But you have to make the effort to walk the path of Dhamma. So one of the aspects of wisdom and taking refuge in our Buddha nature is to understand that our education and all our intellectual pursuits, intellectual knowledge, we begin to see that they are limited. They are limited. And when we identify too strongly with thinking itself, with these our mental formations, we suffer from delusion. And this is what neurosis is. Neurosis is when we identify with our thinking, we identify with feelings, emotions. And every time the mind says I, we think this I is who we are. That is what neurosis is, or mental delusion. So when you reflect on the human condition, you can see that most of us suffer from neurosis, to varying degrees, of course. Because I remember when I also suffered from neurosis, when I was totally trapped in the mind, in the thinking mind. And I saw that when I was trapped in the thinking mind, I had a lot of fear, anxiety, frustration, of course, worry. And you tend to be very self-conscious, and you create an image of yourself, and you're worried about what people are thinking about you or what people are saying about you. The fear of public opinion. That's an aspect of fear. And in the middle of high school, the mind became very disturbed, very frustrated, because I realized that what I wanted was much more than studying subjects. I was a very good student in science and mathematics, and I had a good memory. So academically, I seemed to be, on the right track. But the feelings I was having, let's call it gut feeling, my deep gut feeling was saying, I wanted something much more than this. So at the age of 15, I was ready to leave school. I was ready to travel the world, have unlimited adventure, and to learn more about myself, what it really means to be a human being. And I grew up as a Christian, but by high school I realized that Christianity was just not for me, because I just simply couldn't accept what I was reading or what people told me. So I realized that what I was searching for, I could not find in the Bible. I could not find it in a book. So one day I looked at the mind, and I saw all this mental, emotional turmoil. At the time, I didn't know the word dukkha, but it is dukkha. And I began to ask myself, is it possible for all this mental, emotional turmoil to come to an end? Is it possible for all this obsessive thinking to stop, for the mind to be silent? Because I saw the connection between mental, emotional turmoil, suffering, with, compulsive, obsessive thinking. So I began to ask myself that question. And at that time, I had no teachers, no Dhamma books. The only book I had was the Bible. But by then, I realized what I was looking for, I could not find it in the Bible. Okay? So eventually, I had the opportunity to go to Canada, to do some studies, but that deep dissatisfaction was there. I wanted something more. And when you're young, you tend to be very naive. And I thought, if I can finish my studies, I'll either become a science math teacher or a world-famous scientist, winning the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I was young and foolish. But the most wonderful thing happened to me. I met two people who had traveled to India. And in those days, you could go overland to India and Nepal. And the overland route was through Europe and then Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan into India. In those days, those countries were very stable, including Afghanistan. And I was able to make that journey, and that was the best thing that happened to me. And there I discovered that it was possible for the mind to be silent. Because as you know, initially when your mind is very disturbed, you cannot imagine the mind being silent. All right? And the other question I began to ask was, what is thinking? What is thinking? Because I realized that nobody was teaching me to understand the nature of thinking. What is this thought process? And yet we're thinking all the time. And the other question I had was, what is eternity? I was fascinated by this term, eternity. What is eternity? And of course, I could only imagine what eternity was, just as an idea. And I thought that maybe eternity was, millions and zillions of years in the future. Some unimaginable time in the future. But when I got to India and got to experience the silent mind, and it came very spontaneously, without effort and without desire. When the silent mind came, then I understood what eternity was. And what is interesting, when I'm describing this experience, I cannot say when I experience the silent mind. Because in the silent mind, there's no I. There's no thinking, and therefore no I. So when I try to describe this experience, it is more correct to say when there was that experience of silence, or when the mind was silent. Because there's no I, no thoughts. And when the mind became very silent, suddenly the mind became very open and spacious, very open. Because awareness by nature is spacious. But we normally don't notice the space because we're busy thinking, right? When all that thinking stops by itself, that natural spaciousness happens. And in that silence of the mind, time had stopped, meaning there was no past and no future. Because thinking is what creates the idea of time, of past and future. But in that silence, there is no time. And then I began to understand what eternity was. It was not millions, zillions of years in the future, some unimaginable time in the future, but rather eternity was now, in the present. It's the timeless state of the universe. And we're a part of the universe. We're not separate from it. We're aspects of the universe, of nature, in this temporary physical form, being aware of itself. It's very profound, very profound. And the third thing I realized that as a young child, the mind used to be in that state. And I think most of us experienced it when we were very young. When the mind was timeless and innocent, especially when you're out in the nature, in the natural environment. Because I didn't grow up with television, and thank goodness I didn't have all these electronic gadgets that children have today, even, simple video games. I didn't have all that stuff. I just had nature, looking at nature, and I remember each day was timeless. So maybe you can remember that. I would try to recall that time before the mind became conditioned with more thinking like this. Because when we take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, we begin to understand the whole structure of the conditioned mind, of our conditioned mind. And before I went to India, I had no idea that my mind was a result of conditioning, because I never had that teaching. But once I got to India and I began to read some very profound Dhamma, then I saw the truth, that all our minds are a result of conditioning, social conditioning, and of course formal education, starting in elementary school, high school, college, and if you go to university, that's a part of it. And we're conditioned by the media, by the society in general. Of course, we're conditioned by language, because we cannot avoid learning languages, right? We're conditioned by the climate and by the food, and now the internet and this WhatsApp technology is also a part of our conditioning. And as you know, although this WhatsApp technology is very fast, it's very convenient, and you can do miracles with it, but it's also making us more anxious and more impatient. So this is something we can reflect on. So once I began to understand the whole nature, the whole structure of the conditioned mind, the thinking mind, I began to understand what the Buddha was pointing to. And how we are all conditioned with mental defilements. All of us, we can't avoid it. So even Siddhartha Gautama himself had mental defilements, because our minds have been conditioned, educated to react, to label, to criticize, to judge, to compare, to condemn, to like or not to like, to want or not to want, to have aversion and ill will, which includes, hatred, resentment, jealousy, disrespect, and so on. So it's this conditioning that we have to react, to be always reacting, that creates our mental defilements. And it is these mental defilements and our conditioned habit of reacting that gives us the impression that the I, the self, the ego center is something permanent and separate from the rest of the world, from nature, from society. And when we have the strong attachment to the self, the seemingly permanent, separate self, then we experience a lot of not only craving, but greed, a lot of greed. Of course, hatred, fear, insecurity, worry, and so on. And also what is interesting is that because of our conditioning or education, we don't see this as a source of delusion initially, our habit of reacting, because we see it as just normal behavior, because we all do it. But what the Dhamma is pointing out is that this is our source of delusion and our other mental defilements. Craving, clinging, aversion, delusion, and so on. And it is this habit of reacting all the time is what creates our mental, emotional reality. And you reflect on it. And it has been said that life is really 10% of things happening, events happening, and 90% of us reacting. Reacting. Very interesting. And this is why the Buddha gave such a radical teaching. When he said, when you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. Very radical. It sounds very simple, but as you know, it's very challenging. Because we've been reacting since early childhood. All of us. And it becomes a habit. And he also continued by saying, when we think, just think, and when we know, just know. So when he said, just think, when you think, just think, what he's pointing to is thinking with awareness, which means that when we need to think, we think logically, rationally, because we do need to think in daily life, but when we don't need to think, the mind can be quiet. It can be aware. So there's order in the mind. So we don't have to be thinking all the time. Because as you know, even when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking automatically, compulsively, doesn't it? And so we end up, you can say, we waste a lot of mental energy. And it is this unnecessary thinking that the mind does that creates a lot of our problems. Confusion, anxiety, worry, regret, craving, frustration, and so on. So it is this understanding and this training of the mind with mindfulness that brings order, order into the mind. Again, order means when we think logically, rationally, and when we don't need to think, the mind can be quiet. In other words, we come back to this present moment awareness and the knowing. We come back to Buddha nature. And we're going to have more trust and more confidence in our Buddha nature, the awareness and the knowing, and to see the limitations of thinking. Because as you know, thinking can easily become very illogical and very irrational, doesn't it? When it becomes, obsessive, worrisome, negative, and so on. And a good way of looking at it, it's like if you need to drink something, you use a cup or a glass, and when you finish drinking, you put the cup down, you put the glass down. You don't carry the empty cup or the glass with you. You simply put it down. So it's the same with mental activity. When we need to think, we think logically, rationally, and when we don't need to think, we put it down. We come back to Buddha nature. So that is the confidence and the trust in awareness, mindfulness. So in Dhamma practice, this is the meaning, the true meaning of taking refuge in the Buddha. Taking refuge, trust, confidence in present moment awareness and knowing. And also, one of the miracles of mindfulness in Buddha nature is that it is a state of non-duality. I'll explain that in a moment. But because it's a state of non-duality, it gives us the ability to see things more objectively and let them go. And now, what does that mean? It means that the state of awareness, mindfulness, there's no I, no self who is being aware. There's only that energy of attention. There's no I who is being aware. There's only that energy. Now, initially, we don't see this. Why? Because we're conditioned to identify with all our experiences. So we create duality. And duality means subject and object. Subject and object. And duality begins very innocently when a young child begins to speak, begins to use language. When a child begins to say, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. That is the beginning of duality, meaning subject and object. And the I is always the subject. You see that? Because that duality is in the mind. And that duality of subject and object becomes more deep-rooted when we identify with all our sense experiences. When we begin to say, I am seeing something, I'm hearing something, I'm smelling something, I'm tasting something, I'm feeling something by touch, and I'm thinking something. So we begin to believe that there's really a subject, a permanent, deep-rooted subject, who is doing all this experience, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. But when we practice, we begin to see that the senses are actually sensing by themselves. It's very profound. And this was one of the insights of the Buddha. He realized that the senses were actually just sensing by themselves, and there was actually no one behind it. There's really no one who's actually seeing something. There's no one who is hearing something. There's no one who's tasting something, smelling something, feeling something, or thinking something. Now, let's just do a quick experiment. Just close your eyes for a moment. Just close your eyes for a moment. Now, open your eyes. And you see that seeing consciousness arises spontaneously, doesn't it? You see that? You don't have to make an effort to see. It just happens. You just open your eyes and seeing consciousness arises, just like that. At the speed of light, to be exact. There's no one behind it. But again, because we use language, we say, I am seeing something. Say, for example, I'm seeing the Buddha statue. So it gives you that duality. But I am seeing the Buddha statue. The I, the seer, is separate from that Buddha statue. That duality is there. But initially, you close your eyes, you open, and there's just seeing. It's an amazing insight, but once you see it, it's very clear. And a good example, later when you go home and you eat something, say to yourself, okay, I'm going to eat this thing and I'm going to try not to taste this food. See what happens. As long as you have taste buds on the tongue, tasting will arise. And there's actually no taster that's separate from the food. No, that's separate from the flavor of the food. There's only tasting. There's only hearing, that's right. Right? You don't have to make a special effort to hear the speaker. There's only hearing, right? As long as your ears are healthy. And that's the aspect of Buddha nature. The awareness of just seeing what is happening. It's very profound. Of course, when you're on a retreat, it's much easier to see it. When the mind is more calm, more present, and they've taken away your smartphone from you, so you don't have to be checking it, then you see it very clearly. So, with awareness, mindfulness, there's really no I, no self who is being aware. In other words, there's no subject. There's only the awareness. And so what the Buddha realized, one of the causes of dukkha is that we identify with things, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical, as me or mine. Like my happiness, my unhappiness, my frustration, my problems, my worry, my fears. I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, and so on. And we identify with the body, right? The physical body. This is me, this is mine. And what the Dhamma is showing us is that as human beings, we have this unfortunate habit of identifying with things. And it's unfortunate because whatever we identify with, it's impermanent. It's subject to change. So normally, when a happy feeling arises, we tend to say, I am happy. It sounds perfectly normal, doesn't it? Perfectly normal. When an unhappy feeling arises, we say, I am unhappy. Or I'm sad, I'm bored, I'm lonely, I'm frustrated, I'm worried, I'm afraid, and so on. So when we identify with these feelings and emotions, we hold on to them as something personal. And what the Dhamma is showing us is that these feelings, emotions that we're holding on to, that we're identifying with, they don't really belong to us. They're just phenomena that arises due to conditions. And they're a part of who we are. And on the social level, we say, my name is so-and-so, I live at this address, I have a job, I have a family, and so on. That's our human world, or human convention. But when we apply mindfulness or Buddha nature, present moment, we begin to see the reality of body and mind, rupa and nama, physical and mental process. And we are a process, and we're alive simply because we are a process. It's a very complex process, But that's what keeps us alive. And because we're a process of constant change, we need to recharge this process. The same way you recharge your cell phones, okay? And what is interesting is that it's very easy to overlook this fact that we're a process of body and mind, rupa and nama, in the Pali language. It's very easy to overlook this process, this fact, simply because we are social creatures. We use language, we use names, right? We use labels to communicate, I, you, he, she, and we have names, Tan, Go, Lim, and so on. Because we need names to identify each other more easily. But that's just our social world. But when we apply our Buddha nature, then we see the fact of rupa and nama, physical and mental process. And we go a bit deeper, and we have the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, or the 5 factors that create our daily experience. Now, what is interesting is that when there's a death, we tend to say somebody has died or somebody has passed away, all right? Somebody has died, somebody has passed away. This is our social world, social language, social convention. But when we apply present moment awareness, we see that it's simply this body-mind process, the rupa and the nama, simply stops working. In other words, it shuts down. And you see this as a fact, as a reality, not just as an idea. Because initially, when you hear that we're a process of body and mind, rupa and nama, it is just an idea. But when we practice this and we reflect on it on a regular basis, we see this truth, that we are this constantly changing process. And this is why all our experiences, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical, are impermanent, why they change. Simply because we're this reality of process, physical and mental process. Now, because we don't have this understanding initially, this is why humans have created the belief in ghosts and spirits. Because as you know, humans, even from the early times, have always had to face the great mystery of death and the unknown, right? You see the body of somebody that you've been close to, and it is a great mystery. It has always been a great mystery. What has happened to the person that I knew so well, who I knew and loved? There's just the body there. And it's not going to wake up. It's a great mystery. So we're always faced with the unknown, the mystery, the unknown of death. And because of our fertile human imagination, we say, oh, that person, they have become a spirit, an invisible being. Only if you see that. And that invisible being, that spirit, now lives in the invisible world, or the spirit world. That is why humans have created this belief in ghosts and spirits, because of the great mystery of death and the unknown and the fertile human imagination. And as you know, in Chinese culture, we have the Hungry Ghost Month, right? Where offerings are put everywhere, not only in temple areas, but also in public, right? Because we believe hungry ghosts are wandering, they need food, and they need entertainment. And you'll notice there's a lot of incense burning, especially the giant incense, you know, the giant ones that they use. And there's a reason for that. Because we realize that the spirits cannot consume the physical offerings, you know, food, drink, and so on. So they believe that the essence of the offerings is being carried by the smoke, the incense smoke, into the spirit world. So the spirits can consume and enjoy the essence of the offerings. Now, personally, I don't believe in ghosts and spirits, but I find this very interesting from a Dhamma perspective, why we believe that. But when we have the understanding, you know, of the body-mind process and the five aggregates, how they work and how everything shuts down, then we no longer need to believe in ghosts and spirits and invisible beings. Now, one of the things that I try to do when I'm in Malaysia, Singapore, is to do encourage people to do the cemetery meditation. I haven't been very successful for obvious reasons. In Singapore, we were more successful, simply because one center happened to be very organized, and they encouraged their members to do this. This was their one opportunity to overcome this childhood fear of ghosts and spirits. And those who were brave enough to participate, they became very inspired and very happy that they were able to overcome this childhood fear. Now, recently, when I was in Singapore, we had another cemetery meditation. But this time it was very different because we had to do it in the morning instead of in the evening. So it wasn't scary. But we had to do it in the morning because of the mosquitoes and the threat of dengue fever, because dengue fever is around with all that rain. But we usually do it in the evening. And once I visited a center in Penang, Bodhi Heart Sanctuary. It's called Bodhi Heart Sanctuary. And it's situated in the middle of a very old cemetery off Mount Erskine Road. And when I first went there, 2008, it was still fairly new at that time, that center. So the moment I saw the graves, I thought, we must do a cemetery meditation. And because the location was so ideal, because the graves are around, we didn't have to travel to a cemetery. We were able to encourage 12 people to participate. So after about 10 minutes, light rain began to fall. And I said, don't worry, it's going to go away. It's impermanent. And it went away, but 5 minutes later, the rain started again. And I said, don't worry, it's going to go away. But this time it didn't go away. So after a few minutes of getting, more wet, that I think we better go inside. The spirits are having the last laugh. They're laughing at us. But it is interesting how we believe in ghosts and spirits. But as I said, it has to do with the great unknown, the mystery of death, the unknown, and our fertile human imagination. It's like this. Now, at this time, are there any questions? Are there any questions? Yes.
One thing you said that you got a question, how to stop thinking too much. Then you said, like, after coming to India, you found to calm down the mind.
Yes.
Can you explain, like, the process which you have gone through? Means, like, how many days, what you have done?
Yeah, that's a good question. How to stop the mind from thinking too much.
Because currently I am going through that. Too much. I am unable to control, actually.
Yes. Well, fortunately, I learned this very unique mindfulness practice in Thailand some years ago. It's called dynamic meditation, where instead of watching the breath, you move your hands. I'll demonstrate it for you. And fortunately, it's all on video, so I'll give you the link after. But it's very, very easy to focus your mind and to let go of unnecessary thinking, okay? If you're right-handed, you start with your right hand. If you're left-handed, you start with your left, okay? I'm right-handed, so I'll start with my right. So right or left, the palm goes up like this, then slowly lifting, slowly to the stomach, and you're aware of the hand touching the stomach area, abdomen. Then the left or right hand lifting slowly to the stomach, and you're aware of the hand touching the other hand. And keep your hands very loose, very relaxed. So the right or left hand goes up to the chest, and you're aware of that touch. Then out, down, touching the knee, and then palm down. Left hand up, touching, out, down, and down. Again, right or left, palm up, lifting, stomach, left. Right or left, up to the chest, touching, out, down, down, left. So this is a very easy way to focus the mind, to bring the mind to the present moment. And while we do this, we're aware of thoughts, any thoughts which arise in the mind, arise in consciousness. And we come back to the movements and the hand touching the body. So the mindfulness becomes very clear, very sharp. So you're training the mind to focus and also to let go of unnecessary thinking. Okay, yeah. So I'll give you the link for the video. Okay. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
Just now when you say that, because we always identify ourselves with an eye, so when we see, for example, we always see with our eyes, we see Buddha. But that actually is not what I see. It's more like an awareness that happens, is it? So what actually, the awareness happens and awareness passes away. What I'm trying to say is that if I don't see that, so what actually happens in that?
Okay. Now, there is a physical statue here, okay? When you touch it, you can feel, yes, this is a statue, okay? And what the Dhamma is teaching us, for example, you sitting there and you're looking at the statue. Now close your eyes again for a moment. Right? There's no statue, right? Open your eyes and you see the awareness of the statue is there. So the Dhamma is showing us our experience of the statue is in the mind. It is, isn't it? And this is why the Buddha said, mind is the forerunner of all things. The world itself. We experience the world through the mind, through consciousness. In this case, seeing. Just like when you're eating, you experience the food through tasting. It's like that. And of course, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and of course, thinking. Everything is experienced through the mind, from consciousness. Including when you imagine that there are ghosts and spirits. It's in the mind. The ghosts and spirits are in the mind. You know, the power of the imagination. Okay?
So that means when the subject, when we do the meditation, when the subject does not appear anymore, that means the I disappears. So whatever is left is just the awareness. Because Bhante was saying that, let's say the senses is working on their own. It's not what we actually do. The eyes, the nose, the mouth, they are all working on their own. So when the subject disappears, so the only thing in the mind is that an energy of awareness.
That's right. There's only awareness. That's right. Yeah. But initially, we're so attached to this I, right? and we think it's permanent. Because it's a part of our conditioning, right? The subject, the I, the center of experience. We are so attached to it, and we think it's permanent. And this is why you get to a stage in your life where you look back on your experiences, all your experiences, including working, traveling, going here and there, everything begins to seem more and more dreamlike as you get older. Because this is something I'm experiencing now when I look back at all my experiences, and especially all my travels in India, Nepal, Pakistan, Iran, all these places. And why the past seem more and more dreamlike is because there was no permanent I that was actually experiencing those things. There was only experience. You understand? But initially we say, oh, I went here, I did this, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, the I was nothing permanent. These are something we create in the mind because of language, right? I'm this, I'm doing that, and so on. And that's why our experiences, the past, seem more and more dreamlike. Simply because there was only experience. In other words, there was no permanent center of experience, or no permanent experiencer, right, as the I. There was only experience. It's quite amazing. And I think it's one of the miracles of life and experience. How things are just happening. Things are really just happening. It's quite amazing. You're welcome. Yes. Speaking of imagination, one of the things I often do as an experiment, and I hope you're brave enough to do it. I do this everywhere I go. Of course, it's in the evening, you put all your gadgets away for a moment, internet, your phone, whatever, and you say to yourself, there is something in the room. There's a presence in the room. And the moment I say that to myself, I feel chills and I get goosebumps. Try it if you're brave enough. And sure enough, I feel this presence, and it's usually right behind me, and it's watching me. And you really think it's real. And if you're not mindful, you quickly get out of that room. Because it seems so real. But if you're mindful, you observe it. You observe the power of the imagination. But I do it as an experiment to show you the power of the imagination. Because very often people will tell me, Bhante, I cannot meditate alone at night. Because the spirits will come. But it is the power of the imagination. It's the power of the imagination. It's very powerful. So if you're adventurous, I dare you to try it. There's some presence in the room. Very interesting. You see, and I like to mention when I speak, like in Malaysia, Singapore, about ghosts and spirits, because where I grew up in the West Indies, I was taught about African ghosts and spirits. Because we have African descendants in these islands, because as you know, the Europeans brought slaves from West Africa to grow sugar cane on these islands, because sugar became big business in Europe and England. And people were getting the sweet tooth, And the African culture is very rich in the oral tradition, a lot of stories. And of course, lots of ghosts and spirits. So I was told as a child about these African ghosts and spirits, and there are quite a few of them. And I imagined them, and I thought they were real. But only later I began to realize it's just the power of the imagination. So when I'm in Malaysia, Singapore, I like to say that because I grew up with African ghosts and spirits, I'm not afraid of the Chinese ghosts and spirits, okay? But it's a power of the imagination. Very powerful. But when you're mindful, you know how to deal with it. You know how to deal with it. Yeah. Yes.
So just now Bhante mentioned that when you don't need the thinking, you just keep the mind silent. So, and live in the Buddha picture means the present awareness. So, does this mean that we are practicing this satipatthana? Even just now, Bhante was showing the hand movement.
Yes, yes.
Is it part of the satipatthana practice?
Of course, yes, yeah. It's a part of satipatthana. That's right. Okay. Except this is a more modern version. But you know, the mindful walking is also an aspect of dynamic mindfulness, right? The walking. And that's an ancient practice that the Buddha taught.
Yeah. So, Bhante, so to keep the mind silent, does this mean that we are practicing this satipatthana, the four focuses of introspection? Does it help to keep the mind silent?
Yes, silence is very important during practice. So a good practice is, say, when you're having lunch. If you eat mindfully, silently, you see that it's a very peaceful experience. So say if you're feeling stressed at work, at least at lunchtime, you can eat silently, mindfully, and really feel present and very calm. Instead of scrolling, eating and scrolling on your phone. Because sometimes I watch people eating and scrolling. And if they're not scrolling, they eat for a moment, they stop, they pick up the phone, check, put it down, and they eat a little bit, they stop, they pick up the phone, check, and they put it down. Otherwise, they're just eating and scrolling. But try just eating mindfully in silence, and you see it's very peaceful. And by doing that naturally, whatever stress you're having, in the work environment, you find that the stress will go away, even for 10, 15 minutes. Yeah, the stress will go away. Or you can try, if you have a few minutes, just try the mindful walking. You can say lunch break or coffee break, like this. Okay?
One question. Just now you mentioned about if human mind being able to actually imagine ghosts and spirits, blah blah blah. I can relate to that because it happens to me as well. Because I feel it's always an imagination. But we also taught in Buddhism that there are other 31 planes of existence, which means there are ghosts present in this universe that we live in. So how do we correlate the two together? Our imagination and the real things?
Okay, that's a good question. Fortunately, where I grew up, we didn't have that belief in the 31 planes of existence. Thank goodness. You must remember what you read, in these books, or what we call in Buddhism, are just what you read. Always remember that, and also remember the Kalama Sutta. And the most important thing than the 31 planes of existence is the Four Noble Truths. That is the most important thing. I know I have met a few people who really believe in the 31 planes of existence. I understand that. But fortunately, I did not have that conditioning. So that I don't have to worry about the 31 planes of existence. But people who really believe in it, I say, believe what you want to believe. That's fine. You have that freedom. But the most important thing is present moment awareness, mindfulness, in order to overcome dukkha. And always remember the Buddha's main message was, I only teach one thing. When he had, so many discussions with so many different people with different beliefs, philosophies, teachings, and so on. He always said, I only teach one thing, the truth of dukkha and the ending of dukkha. That is right. Okay? Yes.
So the ghost down here, if you realize the spirituality, when you practice, develop the spiritual power, you can see supernatural power. Buddha realized the whole universe, even human beings, very rare. But the other living beings, ghosts, very uncountable. Here the uncountable ghosts.
Well, you see, I can only speak from my own experience and my own investigation.
So your own experience is not the Buddhist teaching.
Yeah.
That's why idam mama idameva satcham. This is the only truth. So others are wrong. This is the only right. That is not the way.
Right.
As you told, the Kalama Sutta, that the 10 kind of criteria.
Right.
That you have to perceive yourself. So the spiritual perception is different from the this normal sensation.
Right. Now, life and nature, there are energies, no doubt. No doubt. I can feel these energies. Now, I remember when I was in high school, there, Jamaica, there are some areas that are very hilly, this island. And there was one small village in the hilly region. Suddenly, stones came raining down on this village. Now you can imagine the elders, the older people, initially thought there were naughty boys, playing and throwing stones. So they ran out there shouting at the boys to stop this nonsense. But they didn't find any naughty boys, okay? And around the same time, the next day, the same stones came raining down on the village. And again, they ran out, shouting at the boys to stop it, but no boys could be seen. It happened about 3 or 4 times. So then they thought, oh, my goodness, it must be some spirit or ghost, okay? Now, this area was quite remote. So they walked to the nearest town where there was a post office. And in those days, if you didn't have a telephone, you could send a telegram at the post office, at the telephone, a simple old telephone. And they sent a message to the police in the capital, Kingston, to say that something was happening and we cannot explain it. And initially, because no one could be seen that was responsible, they thought it must be some, spirit or ghost. that are throwing all these stones. So the police contacted the University of West Indies, and they sent 2 or 3 scientists. And they had their instruments to come to investigate this phenomenon. And they saw the phenomenon. It happened during the same time of day. And when they investigated, they realized what was causing the stones. It was the wind, because of the location, the hills. The wind had created like what you call whirlwind, like a small tornado, which can be quite powerful, right? A tornado. Because everything is energy in nature, and it whipped up the stones, right? And sent it flying to the village. And interesting enough, a similar phenomenon happened in Australia. There was a shoal of fish, a big school of fish. Were swimming near the surface of the ocean, near the coast. And again, this powerful whirlwind or tornado whipped up all these fish and sent it flying inland, a few kilometers inland, and it rained, all this fish was raining down on this housing development. So you can imagine what the people thought. The fish god, or God had sent the fish. But again, when you investigate, there are forces in nature. Yes?
So I'm confused. You were saying experience and ghost, right? What I understand is that if let's say a person who has done very bad karma, very bad action, so the next rebirth, it will go to the misery, the place of misery, like where the hungry ghost or the spirits world. So how is that different from the spirits that's wandering around the world? How is that different? Or because Buddha say that there is a plane of misery, like the hungry ghost, for example, the spirits.
Always remember that what you read and even what we hear, don't just accept it like that. Myself included. Keep an open mind and reflect, investigate. Okay? Because my understanding of past lives and future lives is very different from what many people believe. Because I do see, you see, from an early age, I've always had a good memory. Okay? And being the last of 6 children, I was always surprising my older siblings how I could remember things that they assume I was too young to remember. But I just had a good memory. And don't say it's past karma. I was just born with it. It's just put it this way, it's my genetic makeup, okay? I tend to be more scientific. Now, why I'm saying that is not to impress you with my early childhood memory, is to say that if it's one thing I cannot remember, it's a past life. I honestly cannot remember that there's a past life. So when I hear about, children who can remember past life, I said, oh yes, it's interesting, but personally, I'm not interested. But I keep an open mind, yes, it's interesting, and life is a great mystery, no doubt. Just like death. Death is also a great mystery. But what I do see in my own investigation, my own practice, is that I have been through many lives in this life. Yes. And to demonstrate that very clearly is to collect all the photos you can get. Maybe you have to ask your mother. for your early childhood photos. And if you can get them, even baby pictures too, sometimes. Some people still have baby pictures. But the point I'm making, if you could line up all your photos, from early childhood, elementary school, high school, college, etc., to your most recent photos, and you look at them carefully, do you ever look the same? Of course not. Because we're a constantly changing process of body and mind. It's this teaching of Rupa and Nama. Nama, Rupa, Rupa, Nama. This is the reality, not just an idea, a concept. You see the truth of it. But what is interesting too is that if you're showing friends your photos, again, because of language, we say, oh, this is me when I was a baby. This is me when I was, 2 years old. This is me in elementary school. This is me in high school. This is me in college or university. This is my graduation picture. This is my engagement picture, if you're engaged, right? Oh, this is my wedding picture, etc., etc. And when I'm trying to point out, because of language, we kept saying, this is me, this is me, this is me, this is me. So by saying that, it gives the impression, the illusion in consciousness that the me never changes. I wonder if you see that, because of language. Me, 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 I. That is the illusion in the mind. Because we're using the same I or the me when we speak. And the equivalent in other languages. So it gives the impression that the I, the me, is rock solid. Understand? And it is everlasting. It is always there. We may see changes around us, but the I, the me, never changes, right? It's always there. But it's an illusion of language and label. But when we have the awareness, we investigate, we realize it's just a label that we're using. So of course, if you still have to speak, you still have to use the I, the me, but once you have that understanding, you're no longer attached to it. You understand? Because you realize it's just a label. Very interesting how we're easily deluded by language and labels, right? Or names. For example, in North America, many people there are very attached to their names. They identify very strongly with their names, just like birthdays. So if you call somebody by a wrong name or you forget their name, big drama, big dukkha. They get very upset. And some people are very particular also how you pronounce their names also. They're that fussy. And you can see this fact, especially when you attend a conference, with lots of people, right? And people have name tags, right? Because then it's easy. Say, oh, Mr. Go, you're Miss Tan, etc. It's very easy. Then you see the truth of it when you see name tags, that our names are just social labels for easy identification. That's all. But they're not really who we are. And that's the wisdom of awareness. When we have the awareness, we begin to see that. Because really who we are is not the I, the me, or the name, the social label, but rather it's the awareness and the knowing, the Buddha nature. And that is intelligence. That's the real intelligence of Buddha nature. That's right. Okay?